All right. Well, then let me get started with what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about the first craft beer brewery that we have in Rwanda. It's called the Kweza Craft Brewery. And more specifically, so I was asked to speak about our main ingredient, which is sorghum. So our entire brewery is based on making beer out of sorghum as the main ingredient. So I'll give you a little bit of background about the brewery itself and kind of what we're based on, and then a little bit of the technical aspects of brewing with sorghum. So feel free, I don't know, I'm not in the room with you all, so if there's major questions or anything, you guys figure out that side, how to get me to stop and answer questions on the spot. Otherwise, there'll be time at the end. All right, let me see if I'm going to share my screen and let's hope that this works. Let's see, can you guys see the presentation?
Yes.
All right, great. So, this is the tale of two sorghums. 'Twas the best of brews, 'twas the worst of brews. Brewing with sorghum is both great and has brought us a lot of headaches. There's nothing that if you're trying to do something that's not normal, it usually isn't that easy. So I'm just going to bring you through some of what we have learned so that hopefully you don't have to go through some of the same pain if you choose to be using the grains from Africa. So why sorghum? Right, sorghum is native to East Africa, which Rwanda is kind of the part of. So my background is actually in botany and forestry and agriculture. So to me, this was a fascinating bridge between the native ecology of Rwanda and the brewing industry. So it's native to here. It's part of the original biodiversity. It doesn't require pesticides, fertilizers, or irrigation. So it's great for farming. And in terms of culture, sorghum is deeply rooted in the Rwandan culture and in the history and the economics. Down here on the Rwandan national crest, if you can see this, this is sorghum that's in the national crest to the left of the basket. That's how important it is to Rwanda. And there is homemade brew here called Ichigaje that's made with malted sorghum. So we're continuing in the tradition of Rwanda. In addition, sorghum is gluten-free. So a lot of the global market is looking for low or no gluten products. And so sorghum beer fits nicely into that. This is Kweza. This is the first craft beer brewery in Rwanda. We registered in January 2020, just in time for COVID. Got our license about a year and a half later to operate. And by the end of 2023, we had this 1,000-liter brew house. And we do make it with a minimum of 70% sorghum in each brew that we make, sometimes more. And so I'll talk you through a little bit of the kind of specialty of this brew house. We did custom engineer it and had it fabricated for us in order to make majority sorghum beer. So there are some unique aspects to this brew house that you won't find in your typical equipment. We also are women and people of color owned and led. So globally, brewing is a $555 billion a year industry. This is huge. I think it's 1 in every 100 jobs in the world touches the brewing industry. But yet only 3% of ownership or management are women and people of color. So that's a not very diverse industry, but yet brewing started in Mesopotamia and Egypt with women brewing. So this is originally an African industry and originally a female industry. And so what we're doing is trying to re-diversify that and bring more people to the table, because who doesn't want more brewers kind of sitting at tasting tables and more people sitting at management tables, so that what ultimately ends up in the market comes from diversified viewpoints and PowerPoints. So our goal through both investment and in operations is to have more women and people of color in gaining generational wealth and gaining different decision roles within the brewing industry. So sorghum, another reason, is because it is of Africa and we're brewing for the African palate. So,
Jess, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry,
yes.
There seems to be an issue with your slides. We can only see the first page of your presentation. I don't know what page you're on. There we go.
Okay, sorry. Let's see. Sorry, you've missed the slide. Let me see what.
That's better.
Okay, let me just see if I can. It seems like it's not doing full screen. Sorry about that.
No worries. We
Let
can
me
now. Is
back
it
up.
page 5? Yeah.
So can you now see why sorghum?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Sorry about the clutter on the screen then. So yeah, I'm just going to show you the visuals of what I just talked to. So this is just why sorghum. This is our beer brewery. They're on the left. And then I was just talking through some of these statistics about women and people of color in the brewing industry. And then so sorghum. So a lot of the global breweries, right, are bringing European styles into Africa. And what we're looking at is how can we take African styles and bring them to the world? And also, what is the palate here? So we find that like Rwandans drinking our beer can smell the sorghum and the aroma instantly. And so they're kind of like, oh, this is our beer. And so what we're trying to do is also bridge history, culture, and modern kind of palates and economics. Sorghum is from Rwanda, and because we're a little bit different, that also means we have to make our own malt. So we do our own malting process in combination with some partners here in town. And we also are doing a lot of research. So there's a lot of questions we have. We've managed to form a brewery based on having sorghum as the major ingredient, but a lot of the like global breweries and yeast providers, hop providers are all saying like, how are you doing this? This shouldn't work. And we know it works. We've developed our process and our recipes through trial and error. But a lot of the things we don't have, we're a very small brewery. We're just a couple people in the brewery, and then another 7 or so kind of more on the distribution, marketing, sales side. And so we partner with places like Carlsberg Brewery and the Carlsberg Research Labs, and the Rwanda Institute for Conservation and Agriculture, so that we can be asking questions about sorghum and figuring out the answers. I'll talk a little bit more about that research after this. So we do source everything locally from farmers, and we do malt it ourselves since there's no commercial malt house in East Africa, definitely not one making sorghum malt. So our products right now, we have about 12 different draft beers that we rotate on draft. And then we have 4 core beers that are in the market. So we have draft beer at the major hotels and restaurants and such. And then we have 2 styles of beer in cans. We have some sodas and non-alcoholics. And then we are also working with a team of about 7 other companies, including a lot of Rwandan agencies and research and academic organizations to develop uniquely Rwandan products out of the native plants, fruits, yeast, et cetera, that are native to the Rwandan biodiversity. And this past year, we won the bronze medal for African specialty beer, the African Beer Cup. And we were so happy to get this award, also because we are a sorghum-based beer. I don't know how many of you have done research into or are looking to be beer judges. The way that the beer judging world works is you have to meet a standard, right? And that standard is often set by European, North American categories of, what the definition of an IPA or the definition of all the different beers. And those are often based on barley as the main ingredient, right? So the goal to win an award is to get as close to that style as possible. Whereas what we do is we brew with sorghum. So putting our beer into a regular competition is like putting a rum into a vodka competition, right? They're different ingredients that you're starting with. It's a different product that you end up with. And so being able to have a sorghum beer, and all of us who make beers with different ingredients, right? This is, I think, a really great thing for the beer world to be able to see that there are other types of ingredients and that there's other things, that it's not about trying to meet only this one standard. It's about how many different kinds of delicious products can the world come up with. So we were really excited to win this award. kind of really helping to promote sorghum in the brewing world. So over this, and it's also the market, right? The market loves our beer. So we're in, the 5-star hotels, we're in supermarkets, we're in duty-free shops, we're going nationwide with distribution. And, we're big in the tourism world. So a lot of people, like in South Africa, right, like to go to breweries as part of tourism. So we have a big representation of tourism. So the nice part is people like the beer, and that brings sorghum and African brewing more into the global discussion. So now more about sorghum itself. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with sorghum directly. It physically, this is what it looks like when it's the grains on the head. There's no husk, unlike barley, and they're small little round seed grains. They do have a high starch level, but they have low enzyme activity, which isn't great for brewing. But on the plus side, there's no gluten, so as the base grain. We've been doing a lot of looking into different sorghum varieties and what they mean for beer. So the most common, at least here in Rwanda, is red sorghum. So it's more commonly used for food, for porridges and such. It's pretty accessible. It has a kind of rounder flavor, especially if you're looking for, a porridge that has flavor that's good. However, white sorghum is also available. It's not as easy to come across, but it has a kind of, if you're looking for a brewing grain, it has more of a neutral, clean flavor. So that, some people are more preferring to go with white sorghum to brew with. It does have higher amounts of alpha amylase and fermentable sugars, and overall kind of performs better in extractions with proteins and nitrogen, just kind of across the board of some of the tests that we've been running with Carlsberg Research Laboratories. The white sorghum has so far been performing better. So we're also working, this is some of our team. These pictures are the team out in the field with the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture, they planted 6 different varieties of sorghum for us that came from the national seed banks. And we're just looking at, what would they all do for brewing? And then also they're looking more at the agricultural side of them. So selecting for drought resistance, low bird predation, if they have good head density and kernel size. There's also gelatinization temperature. We'll talk a little bit about that. Strangely seems to be lower for all the varieties that came from Rwanda compared to European grown varieties. We don't know why, but this is what research is about. We found that. Now the next question is, okay, now why? And then obviously looking for other brewing selections in terms of how can we grow what we then need in the supply chain. So for malting, the typical home scale here, right, is like 10 or 20 kilograms a batch. And people malt for home use to make ichigache, but we're obviously a commercial brewery, so we need about 200 kilos in a batch. So we've been working with different organizations to try to scale up the home brewing tradition. So we do have a woman who does the majority of our malting who has done it at a home scale for a long time. So she follows the traditional Rwandan method, but in a facility that's ISO certified, has controls so that we're able to maintain the kind of food quality chain and consistency, but while adhering to traditional methods. So the process for malting, I don't know how many of you have looked into malting itself, right? Because the grain itself, whether it's barley or sorghum or millet or whatever grain you're using to brew, the seed itself is a locked up starch. And what we're really looking to do is to trick that plant into thinking it's going to grow so that it starts to convert to begin to make sugars accessible. So the process to do that is to basically act like nature. So we soak them, so we make them think it's raining out. So they have to soak for a bit. Then in Rwandan methods, ash is added to the process, and it's been found through some different researchers that it extracts polyphenols that inhibit enzymatic activity. So that helps us in the end with more enzymatic activity. It does not work if you use different methods that other people have looked into. So, and then it germinates, then we dry it. You can either dry in the sun or using an oven, using derooting. And then we roast, for example, we make a porter out of our sorghum. And so we roast that at that point. So on the right is pictures of some tests that Carlsberg Research Laboratory did with the varieties that we sent from Rwanda, in order to look at the different malting, like the different germination and stuff between different varieties. So there are low enzymes in sorghum, so that's something that we do need to protect. Other breweries will sometimes add enzymes. We tried that, but didn't necessarily prefer the results. So we prefer to do the traditional malting to get as many natural enzymes as possible out of the sorghum. And then milling. So one of the issues with sorghum is because it's round and because it's small, the typical milling machines that are used for brewery, the milling machines are kind of built around the physical structure of barley, right? It's oblong, it has a husk, it kind of it gets grabbed by the milling machine because it's not round, whereas ours just kind of end up getting stuck sometimes in the middle because they're just spinning. So we've had to work really hard on making sure the gap, the mill gap is very specifically set, and that we handle it differently, because these are such small grains, but our goal is to kind of crack each one in half, but we don't want to go further than that because sorghum easily turns into a flour. But we also need it to crack in order to be able to obviously get those sugars into the solution. So milling has been a bit of a headache for us, but it's a necessary part of the process, so you figure it out. And in mashing, so this is our mash tun. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor. I'm gonna put it here. So we have a cold water inlet, which isn't so common in mash tuns. And then also these motors on the top are a little bit bigger and stronger than your typical mash tun and lauter tun. And some of that is because in a typical mash tun, you'd heat it up to, about 65 Celsius for mash with barley. But what we need to do is we need to do a much higher temperature mash to begin with, at about 85, because sorghum's gelatinization temperature is so much higher. So what we do first is we mash the sorghum at a higher temperature. Then that's why we had to add in this cold water pipe, because then we need to cold crash the whole mash tun to get it down to 65 to add in barley, because we still use a small amount of barley, mostly for those enzymes. We are looking at ways to completely remove barley, but right now that's our process. And so we still do need it at 65 in order to do the proper mash technique for barley. So we do have different, like we built this differently. I'm not entirely sure doing, brewing with sorghum on a barley-based equipment. Some of the adjustments would need to be made in different ways. And also the other thing about this process is that we end up with a high pH. So ours ends up at about 6.5 versus with barley, you're at a much lower pH. But in the end, it seems to settle out to proper acid. And then here, I think I've heard of P-Way's name a few times. Here's a P-Way up in Rwanda helping us set up. So she was here to help us put our equipment together and get it running. And this is our team being completely stuck on a stuck mash, because sorghum, because it's so dense and so tight, does tend to get very stuck in either the mash or the transfer. So we have really worked on methods of keeping viscosity up and running our paddles at such a high speed, so it kind of creates almost a vortex that shoots it through the transfer, because as soon as it slows down, it tends to get stuck. So that's been one of those things that we've had to really rinse and repeat and try different things and ditch batches at times just because it got very stuck. So if I were to build the equipment again, there'd be some modifications I'd make, but we make it work. The other thing is that we do put some rice hulls into the actual mash to help with this. And then here, this is a small batch, but just to physically show you, our lauter is, we put a lot of rice hulls into the lauter. Because sorghum is so dense, lauters are very hard otherwise. And so we mix in a lot of just rice hulls in order to kind of mimic almost what a barley hull or our barley husk would do in a barley mash. So that's how we work through our lauters. And fermentation, this is another one that, the yeast companies have said this shouldn't work, because essentially as a barley centric, company, which pretty much all the commercial brewery or the commercial yeast companies are, they're looking at everything from a barley perspective. So sorghum is considered an adjunct to them, and their yeasts are not made to ferment the adjuncts the best. But to us, the sorghum is the main ingredient and the barley is kind of the adjunct. And so the yeast companies even have told us this really shouldn't be working, but it does. And so we carry on, and we're looking at developing different yeast strains that might work best with sorghum, some of the traditional ones here that people use, or different hybrids. So there's still more study needed on yeast. We do find that Saison and Gvik yeasts work really nicely. Saison, just because it has it tends to meld very well with the sensory aspects of sorghum, we find. Also yields a higher alcohol beer, which some people are looking for. And the Gvik yeasts, they seem to work really well with sorghum profiles. So those are our main ones. But we do use, your Seyfel 04 and 05 and different yeasts as effectively. So yeah, and one of the projects we're working on is isolating traditional sorghum beer yeasts. So there's a couple of sources that Rwandan women go to for sourcing the yeast that they use to make traditional sorghum beer. And we've been in discussions with different yeast companies about trying to isolate those and figure out how we can put those on the market. So, and sensory wise, sorghum beer tends to feel, I'd call it smoother. Even at the same carbonation rates, there is something about our suspicion, again, there's a lot of research needed, but we do it because it works. So our suspicion is because there's less protein in sorghum beer, and that the carbonation doesn't really have a lot to hang on to. And so even if there's the same amount of carbon dioxide, when you drink it, a lot of people say, hey, it tastes a little flatter, and it's a mouthfeel. There's also the perceived bitterness is interesting. For like an IPA, like our Queza IPA, which is our top seller, we put about half the amount of hops that we would put into a barley beer. Sorghum just carries hops completely differently, which is nice. You save money because hops is one of your most expensive ingredients. And so we find that sorghum carries hops in an entirely different way. And we've worked with hops companies like Yakima Chief Hops in order to develop which hops complement sorghum the best. And we found ones with high oils, for example, help, especially with the mouthfeel. So there's different aspects that you can look for in your hops to complement sorghum as a flavor and as a physical ingredient. Some people call sorghum tangy, or it has a twang to it. Other people can't tell the difference between it and a barley-based beer. So some people really love it. And it's a different base grain, right? So you're going to end up with some taste differences. Our beer is, by EU standards, we've had it tested, is considered a very low gluten. So we'd be able to put that on packaging. And we're looking to develop a gluten-free beer in the future. But that's just due to the small amount of barley we use because of for the enzymes. And that's the end. So these are our two canned beers. I'm sorry, I was supposed to be there for this talk in person and to bring you some of this beer. I'm sorry you can't get it today. Hope to be able to share it with you in the future.
Thank you, Jess. We do have some time for a few questions if there are any in the audience.
you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask how you incentivize local farmers to farm a specific sorghum variety for you.
Good question. We haven't gotten yet to the point of sourcing the very specific sorghum that we're finding that might lead to different flavor profiles we want or different brewing characteristics. Right now, we're still using the kind of the common red sorghum that's available across the market. And so that's available with most farmers. So in the future, what we will be looking at that. But there's a lot of farmers who have approached us because signing with signing a contract with a brewery saying we'll buy this many kilos of sorghum from you is appealing to farmers. And so what we're looking at is just creating a relationship where we guarantee to buy X amount of kilos, so that they know that they have a market for their specific sorghum. Some of our investors are, specifically interested in how do we create the right relationships with farmers. So, what will they need upfront in order to plant things that maybe aren't as common? So we're in the middle of developing, what would a more specific sorghum variety sourcing look like?
Hello. Thank you for such an informational presentation. I wanted to ask, since you were saying that with the same CO2 levels, it's the sorghum beer is perceived as flat. Were there any other alternatives you tried, like nitrogen maybe, to see if it has the same effect?
It's a great question. That's the kind of spirit we love at Quasar because therefore we're always trying to say, what else could we try or what have we not considered? We have not yet tried nitrogen just because it's really hard to source food grade gases here in Rwanda. We don't even our carbon dioxide has to be imported. So we don't have any CO2 producers here in the country. So we have looked into, it would actually be cheaper for us. We're looking into getting investment in order to get a nitrogen generator, in order to do things like try different nitrogen, even for our draft systems to be able to use more of a gas mix to be able to send to our customers. So it's a good thought to see what nitrogen as the carbonation agent would do with sorghum. These are the questions that are fascinating to try, because not a lot of work has been done in this world. So great question, and I don't know the answer yet.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Cool, cool, cool. I heard that you said you used a lot of sorghum as compared to barley, which is obviously non-conventional, which makes you guys unique, right? And you said, I don't know, they said it wouldn't work with with your hops and stuff, and then you said you kind of tried to figure out what types of hop would work with that, that whole combination, which yes, you kind of figured it out, obviously, because it's doing well. So what I want to know is like, how how do you know, like, in terms of like the raw material, like how, because the most important thing is to be extracting the sugars, right? So like, what type of other like raw material can we look at in terms of like extracting sugars now? Because probably there's definitely other more, because there's, yes, so like that's basically my question. I don't know if should I repeat it or
So the sugars themselves are not the problem. It's more the enzymes. And so that's what we've been looking for, what other kind of natural sources of enzymes. We people have suggested papaya, like there's a whole, and again, another world. This is why you guys going into the brewing industry, you don't need to necessarily brew, German style beers just because that's what the big brewing industry does. There's a lot of fascinating stuff in fermentation, brewing and fermentation. So one of those things would be, like when you have sorghum, are there other sources of enzymes that can be used? Or is it just finding different yeasts? What are the different combinations? So rather than, because what I find is that a lot of people that have been trained in the kind of barley-based brewing world, industrial world, are trying to figure out how to make sorghum match barley. and how it acts. But instead, what I'd prefer, and like how we kind of operate is, let's not assume that sorghum should act like barley. Like, let's just kind of, we know what barley does, and let's take that knowledge of how things work. And now let's assume sorghum as its own thing and figure out what it works for sorghum. And so everything from what are the best fermentation temperatures for it, it grows in more tropical environments. So why wouldn't we look for, yeasts that ferment in more tropical environments? There's all kinds of like, how can we take the knowledge we know and in so many ways like respect and use that knowledge, but also break open all the boxes and say, what are we really looking for here? So in fermentation, we're looking for a way to convert those starches into sugars and then convert those sugars, into alcohol. So what are all the different methods and ways we can do that? And that is definitely not an exhausted category. So if you guys are all looking for research topics, that's a good question for one.
Hi. Why do you add rice on your mix?
So we don't actually add rice itself. We're only using the rice hulls, the empty plant matter around the rice grain itself. And that is because it's a light, fluffy thing. And because sorghum, when the small sorghum grains that then have been milled and now have gone through a mash, they're soft and they tend to compact, and then they don't want to move, they don't want to lauter. It forms a very dense material. It's like, imagine if you take flour and you mix it with water, right? And then you try to like put it in a colander and strain it. It just doesn't want to do it. And so what the rice hulls do is allow us to kind of lighten that load up and make it a little bit more porous so that it will transfer and it will lauter. So it's just to kind of dilute the density of sorghum. So it could be you could use other materials. It doesn't have to be rice hulls, but Rhonda grows a lot of rice. And so that's the agricultural material that we found to be available here.
Hi, Jessi. Thanks for
Hello.
your presentation. I just wanted to ask, at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about not only exporting an African product to the global market, but also the African brewing style. So what was the motivation behind building this plant in Rwanda? Because I mean, with the hunger and poverty challenges in Africa, I mean, sorghum could easily be a staple diets. So why have you also explored if, say, there's an interest? Because I'm sure in global spaces there's places where they would not consume sorghum, where else in Africa that could easily be, a substitute. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of sorghum, grown here. So we're not looking to take from food supplies. It's actually not allowed by the Rwandan government. And so if the Rwandan government sees that a food source is being used and taken for something like alcohol or junk food or something else, they will actually actively prevent it from happening. And so there's enough sorghum here that has not been the concern. They don't think that it's affecting the food supply for, porridge and things that people are using sorghum for. And so, yeah, we're not looking to compete with food supplies. And the interesting part is, so my background is actually, I come from like nonprofits and the environmental world. And I had a lot of kind of ethical wrestling with myself in terms of like, alcohol is, it's not great for our bodies. And so, what should I be putting my time and my effort to in my life? But also if, I know that I think you guys, I didn't hold that slide up for too long. But the brewing industry is a $555 billion a year global industry. That is 97%, run by white men. And the wealth is held there, right? So what we're looking to do is also to diversify wealth and decision making and power decisions. You know, if every 1 in 100 jobs touches the brewing industry, but you know, women and people of color are not represented in how that gets done, that's where I find the really challenging and fascinating part is like, how do we re-diversify this industry that is so powerful and is so wealthy? And you know, we all are beer fans, right? We all like our beer at the end of the day. So yeah, like people aren't going to stop consuming beer. And so how do we make ethical decisions, and how do we, like, our entire brewery is based on values, and so we make our economic decisions and are based on those values. So yeah, so we're not competing for a food supply. That I would not do. And two, you know, how do we use business to create other ripple effects in power dynamics and wealth dynamics within existing industries? I hope that answers the question.